It started with a simple plan, just a quiet weekend away in a cabin deep in the hills. I wanted to get away from everything. Work had been too much, life had been exhausting, and I just needed a few days to myself. No phone calls, no emails, no noise. Just me, the sound of the wind in the trees, and maybe the occasional snap of a twig from some harmless animal in the brush. I had found the cabin online. It was one of those old single-room wooden places that looked like it had been there for decades. The kind of place where the walls were thick, the windows small, and the air smelled of damp wood. The listing had described it as rustic and secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was peaceful. The roads twisted through thick forests, the sun dipping low behind the hills as I made my way further from civilization. There weren't any houses along the road, no signs of people, just the occasional dirt path leading off into the woods. I finally found the turnoff, a narrow, bumpy trail that cut into the trees. My truck barely fit between the branches, and I had to take it slow, the tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen leaves. When I reached the cabin, I shut off the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening. It was quiet, not silent, but quiet in a way that felt different. No hum of distant traffic, no voices, just the wind rustling the trees and the occasional chirp of some birds settling in for the night. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and grabbed my bag. The cabin was just as I expected. Small, old, a little rough around the edges. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sloped low, and the windows were dirty. The front door had a heavy latch, and when I pushed it open, it creaked on its hinges. Inside, it was simple. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a bed pushed up against the wall. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a dusty bookshelf filled with forgotten paperbacks, and a single oil lamp sitting on the counter. It smelled like wood smoke and old fabric. I locked the door, dropped my bag on the floor, and sat on the bed. It was firm, but I didn't mind. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here to be alone. I spent the evening the way I had planned. I cooked a simple meal on the gas stove, read a little by the weak light of my flashlight, and sat by the window, looking out into the dark trees. The stars were bright, the air cool, and everything felt calm. I went to bed early, listening to the distant hoot of an owl as I drifted off. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was dark, the air still. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a sound from outside. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, careful footsteps, moving just beyond the walls of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sound was faint, but it was there. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just wandering by. They were circling the cabin. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where they were. The crunch of gravel, the rustle of leaves. It was too dark to see, but I could hear them. They stopped near the front door. I gripped the flashlight in my hand like a weapon. A long silence. Then the door handle rattled. A cold wave ran through my body. Someone was trying to get in. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. The door was locked, but the latch wasn't strong. I had seen it when I arrived. If they really wanted in, they could probably force it. The handle rattled again, a little harder this time. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps moved again, slower now. They circled the cabin once more, then faded into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night. I didn't move, didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, listening, waiting. Morning finally came. The sunlight crept through the dirty windows, chasing away the shadows. I finally let out a long breath and stood up, my body stiff from staying still for so long. I walked to the door and listened. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I unlocked it and stepped outside, my breath visible in the morning chill. The ground was covered in leaves and twigs, but there, clear as day, were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They led from the trees to the door, around the cabin, then back into the woods. I scanned the treeline, every instinct in me screaming that I wasn't alone. But I saw nothing. I turned, went back inside, and locked the door behind me. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, got into my truck, and drove out of there as fast as the narrow trail would let me. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I had never been much of a traveler, but when my friend offered me the chance to stay at his family's old cabin in the mountains of Mexico, I thought it might be a good way to clear my head. Life had been a mess lately. Work stress, a breakup that had drained me, and a general sense of exhaustion that I couldn't seem to shake. The idea of spending a few weeks away from everything, out in the quiet wilderness, sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was deep in the mountains, far from any major town. I flew into Mexico City, rented a truck, and drove for hours through winding roads that gradually became less and less maintained. Eventually, I reached a small village where I had to stop for supplies, food, water, fuel for the generator. The locals were friendly but seemed surprised when I told them where I was going. One old man even shook his head and mumbled something under his breath, but I didn't pay much attention. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun was starting to set. The dirt road leading into the mountains was rough, barely more than a trail, and I had to take it slow to avoid damaging the truck. It took another hour before I finally saw the cabin appear through the trees, a small wooden structure, weathered by time but still standing strong. It was simple, just one floor with a covered porch and a tin roof. The windows had old wooden shutters, and there was a small chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected, and the silence was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful, but something about it also made me feel strangely uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation, the fact that I was truly alone out here. I spent the first few days settling in. The cabin had no electricity, but the generator worked fine. There was an old gas stove for cooking, a well for water, and a stockpile of firewood stacked against the side of the cabin. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, with dust covering the furniture and cobwebs in the corners. But it was nothing I couldn't clean up. I spent my days hiking, reading, and just enjoying the solitude. But after a few nights, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. It was little things at first, small details that could have been my imagination playing tricks on me. One night, I woke up to what I thought was the sound of footsteps outside. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a stray dog, but something about the rhythm of the steps sounded deliberate, like someone walking, pausing, then walking again. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and slowly opened the door. The porch creaked under my weight, and the beam of light swept across the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing, just the trees, their dark shapes swaying in the wind. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The only sound was my own breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I decided to check the area around the cabin, just to reassure myself. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But as I walked around the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange. The stack of firewood had been disturbed. Logs that had been neatly stacked were now scattered on the ground. like someone had gone through them. Again, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had knocked them over. Maybe I just hadn't stacked them as well as I thought. That night, I made sure to secure everything before going to bed. I locked the doors, closed the shutters, and even put a chair under the handle just to be safe. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't footsteps, it was a faint tapping. A slow, rhythmic sound, like someone gently knocking on wood. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I realized it was coming from the window, the one right next to my bed. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The knocking continued, slow and steady. I wanted to turn on my flashlight, but I was afraid. If there was someone outside, I didn't want them to know I was awake. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? And why wouldn't they just call out or knock on the door like a normal person? By morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to leave. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and got ready to drive out. But when I went to start the engine, nothing happened. The truck was dead. I tried everything, checked the battery, looked for any obvious issues, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what was wrong. I felt a growing sense of panic. The nearest village was miles away, and I didn't have a way to call for help. My phone had lost signal the moment I entered the mountains. I decided to wait until morning and then hike back to the village. It would take a full day, but at least I wouldn't be stuck here. I spent the rest of the day gathering supplies for the hike, making sure I had enough water and food to last me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I kept the flashlight in my hand, ready to turn it on at the first sign of movement. But nothing happened. At sunrise, I left the cabin and started walking. The forest was dense, the path winding and uneven. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and I started to worry I had taken a wrong turn. The trail should have led me downhill, but somehow I found myself going in circles. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading away from the direction of the cabin. I wasn't alone out here. I forced myself to stay calm and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The trees felt too quiet, the air too still. I quickened my pace, pushing forward even as my legs burned with exhaustion. By the time I reached the village, it was nearly dark. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I found a mechanic, got a ride back up to the cabin, and had the truck towed. The battery had been disconnected. Someone had done it on purpose. I didn't stay to find out who. I left that same day, never looking back. I don't know who or what was out there in those mountains, but I know one thing: whatever it was, it wanted me to stay. And I wasn't about to find out why. I don't think I'll ever go back to that place. I was never a big fan of camping, but my job had me working out in the deep woods of Colorado. I was a forestry worker, mostly doing land surveys and checking for any illegal hunting or logging. I'd been at it for about 6 years by then, and most of the time I enjoyed the solitude. My work took me deep into areas people didn't bother with. No roads, no cell service, just endless trees and wildlife. It never really scared me, but that one trip changed everything. It was late October, and I was assigned to check a remote cabin that the forestry department owned. It was an old ranger's cabin, built decades ago, now mostly used as a rest point for workers who needed to stay overnight. It was deep in the woods, nearly 30 miles from the nearest town, and the only way to reach it was a rough dirt trail that required a truck with high clearance. I had been there once before, maybe 2 years earlier, and remembered it as a quiet, peaceful spot. Just a simple wooden structure with a tin roof, a stone chimney, and a front porch with a couple of old chairs. Inside, it had a single room with a bed, a wood-burning stove, and a small table. No electricity, no running water, just a place to rest. The drive out took me nearly 2 hours. The dirt road was rougher than I remembered, filled with deep ruts and fallen branches. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already low in the sky. The place looked the same as before, but something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the season. The trees were bare. The air had that sharp, cold bite that came before winter. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking a long look around. The place was dead silent. No birds, no wind rustling the branches. Just the distant sound of my truck's engine ticking as it cooled. I shook off the unease and went inside. Everything was as it should be, dusty but undisturbed. I set my bag down on the table, checked the stove, and made sure the place was secure. My plan was simple: spend the night, check the surrounding area in the morning, then head back to town. After a quick meal of canned soup, I locked the door, stoked the fire in the stove, and got ready to sleep. That was when I heard the first noise. It was faint, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. A soft, rhythmic tapping like something moving outside. I sat up, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying through the brush. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and stood by the door, heart pounding. I listened for a long time, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just on edge because of how isolated I was. I told myself it was nothing, climbed into the old bed, and forced myself to sleep. I woke up sometime in the night to complete silence. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange glows against the walls. Then I heard it again.
Top.
Tap.
Top.
It was closer now, right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then I heard something worse. A sound I will never forget. It was my voice. I swear to God, I heard my own voice, right outside the cabin. It was quiet, like a whisper, but it was me, calling my name. My body turned to ice. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, but I wasn't. The sound was real. It came from just beyond the walls. I grabbed my hunting rifle and stood up slowly. My hands were shaking as I moved toward the window. The glass was dirty, but I could see out into the dark forest. Something was standing just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it was tall, too tall, and its arms were too long. It didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the darkness. Then it took a step forward. I raised my rifle, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The thing moved oddly, like it wasn't used to walking. Its legs bent the wrong way. Then it spoke again. "Help me." My own voice, but distorted, stretched out. I nearly pulled the trigger, but I was too scared to move. The thing took another step forward, and the porch creaked. It was on the steps. That snapped me out of it. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and the thing let out this horrible, wet-sounding cry. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Then it ran. Not like a person. Not like an animal. It moved in a way that made no sense, like it was glitching, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting for morning. The moment the sky turned gray with the first light of dawn, I grabbed my bag, threw it into my truck, and sped out of there without looking back. I told my supervisor that the cabin was in bad shape and needed to be taken off the roster. I made sure no one else was sent out there alone. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing: it wasn't human. It was late autumn when I decided to build the cabin. The air was getting colder every day. The trees had turned into a sea of red and orange, and the rain had started coming down more often. I had been planning this project for months, wanting a small retreat away from the noise of town, somewhere I could go to be alone. It wasn't going to be anything fancy, just a simple one-room structure with a roof strong enough to handle the winter. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the nearest road. The land had belonged to an old friend who had moved away years ago, and he had given me permission to use it. It wasn't a perfect clearing. I'd had to chop down a few trees, dig out the stumps, and level the ground, but it was private, and that was all I wanted. I had brought all my materials out there little by little, driving my truck as far as I could before unloading and carrying everything the rest of the way by hand. The day I started building, the weather wasn't bad. The sky was gray, and I could tell it was going to rain, but I had no choice but to get started. I had already taken time off work, and if I didn't finish the cabin soon, the real storms would make it impossible. I had a tarp to cover my supplies and enough food to last a few days. I wasn't planning on leaving until the cabin was standing. By late afternoon, I had the foundation set, just a simple wooden frame resting on concrete blocks. The rain started while I was nailing down the floorboards. It came in light at first, just a soft tapping on the leaves around me. But by evening, it had turned into a steady downpour. The air smelled of wet earth, and the sound of the rain filled the woods, drowning out every other noise. I had my lantern set up, casting a small glow over my work, but beyond that, everything was dark. I kept working. The walls were the hardest part, lifting the wooden panels into place and securing them while the wind pushed against me. The rain had soaked through my jacket, and my hands were numb from the cold, but I didn't stop, couldn't. The longer I waited, the harder it would be to finish. At some point, I realized how alone I really was. There was no one else out here. The nearest house was miles away, and even if I had wanted to call for help, there was no signal this deep in the woods. It wasn't something that had ever bothered me before, but that night, with the rain and the dark pressing in around me, I felt it. I worked until my arms ached, forcing the last few panels into place. The roof would have to wait until morning. I just needed to get inside, get dry, and rest for a few hours. I stretched a tarp over the top of the walls, just enough to keep most of the rain out, and then I stepped inside. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a wooden floor, and my lantern sitting in the middle. But at least I wasn't out in the open anymore. I pulled off my wet jacket, set up my sleeping bag in the driest corner, and sat down to eat something. The rain was still coming down hard, hammering against the tarp above me. I tried to ignore it, but something felt off. The sound of the rain had changed, like there was something moving outside, something heavier than just water hitting the ground. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that I had been out in the cold too long. But the feeling didn't go away. I listened. The wind was howling, making the trees creak and groan, but underneath all of that, there was something else. A slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. I stopped chewing, holding my breath. The rain masked the exact direction, but it was close, just outside the cabin. I strained my ears, waiting to hear it again, but for a long time, there was nothing. I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. A bear, though I hadn't seen any signs of them in the area. Still, I reached for the hatchet I had left near my sleeping bag, just in case. I wasn't about to take any chances. Minutes passed. The rain continued. I didn't hear anything else. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it had been nothing, that I was just on edge from being out here alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me snap awake, my grip tightening on the handle of my hatchet. The rain didn't stop. The wind rattled the tarp above me. The walls of the cabin weren't finished, just bare wood with gaps between the planks, and I kept thinking I saw movement through them. Shadows shifting, something watching from the darkness outside. By morning, the storm had let up, but the ground was a mess of mud and wet leaves. I forced myself to eat something, my body aching from the day before, and then I got back to work. I had to finish the roof. I climbed up, setting the wooden beams in place. The sky was still gray, and the air was damp, but at least it wasn't raining anymore. I worked as fast as I could, securing the boards and covering them with waterproof sheeting. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a broken tree, a dark shape standing at the edge of the clearing. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a tree. It was a figure. It stood just beyond the tree line, too far to make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. My hands froze on the nail I had been hammering. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't look away. For a long time, it didn't either. Then, slowly, it turned and walked back into the woods. I climbed down from the roof, my legs shaking. My first thought was that it was a hunter, maybe someone who had gotten lost in the storm. But I knew that wasn't right. Whoever it was hadn't called out to me, hadn't made any sign that they needed help. They had just stood there, watching. I packed my things. The cabin wasn't finished, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. I hiked back to my truck, every step feeling like something was crawling up my spine. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again, but the woods were empty. I didn't go back to the cabin. A few weeks later, I told myself I had overreacted, that it had been nothing, that my mind had played tricks on me. But sometimes, when I drive past the turnoff to that old trail, I wonder if the cabin is still standing. And I wonder if whoever was watching me that night ever went inside. I had never been the kind of person who sought out isolation, but when my uncle left me his old hunting cabin deep in the valley, I figured it might be good to get away for a bit. The past year had been rough. Work had drained me, and I needed time to breathe. The cabin was old, but sturdy, and it sat at the edge of a dense forest. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, hidden from the rest of the world. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my truck just outside the clearing. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds, and the place itself looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was worn, the windows covered in grime, and the porch sagged under its own weight. Still, it was mine now, and I planned to make the most of it. I spent the first few hours clearing out dust, opening the windows to let in some fresh air. Inside, the cabin was simple: one main room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a door leading to the bedroom. The walls were lined with old hunting gear, a few rusted knives, and a rifle that looked like it hadn't been fired in decades. By the time I finished unpacking and stacking some firewood by the door, the sun had begun to set. The valley was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. Felt peaceful. I made myself a quick dinner, some canned soup heated over the old stove, and sat on the porch as darkness settled over the valley. I had expected the quiet, but there was something about the silence that felt different. Too still, almost like the woods were holding their breath. It was late when I finally went inside and locked the door behind me. I wasn't afraid, but I double-checked the windows and made sure the rifle was within reach before turning in for the night. That first night, I slept deeply, exhausted from the drive and the work I had done. But something woke me up just before dawn. A sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush outside. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it was something else. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They moved around the cabin, crunching through the fallen leaves. I held my breath, gripping the old rifle with sweaty hands. The footsteps stopped near the porch. There was a long silence, then the sound of something scraping against the wooden steps. I stayed completely still, forcing myself to breathe as quietly as possible. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun rose, I went outside to look. The ground was damp from the night air, and sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt. Deep human footprints. Someone had been out there. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe someone who had gotten turned around in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching the cabin. I spent the day keeping myself busy, clearing some of the overgrown path leading to the stream nearby, chopping more wood. I even checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded. By nightfall, I was on edge. I locked the door again, set the rifle by the bed, and forced myself to sleep. But the footsteps came back. This time, they were closer. I could hear the wood creaking on the porch, slow, deliberate steps moving back and forth. I gripped the rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, a sound I'll never forget. The doorknob rattled. It was slow at first, like whoever was outside was testing it. Then harder. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my hands shaking. I wanted to yell, to make some kind of noise to scare them off, but I didn't. I just waited. Then, after what felt like forever, the rattling stopped. Silence. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any movement. But nothing else happened. When morning came, I checked outside again. More footprints, this time right up to the door. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into the trees. Whoever it was, they knew the area well. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven away. But something in me refused to. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I wanted to know who was out there. The next night, I stayed up, waiting. The footsteps returned. This time, I didn't just listen. I moved slowly to the window, just enough to peek outside. I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the tree line. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. His face was shadowed, but I could see that he was staring directly at the cabin. At me. I stayed still, my breath caught in my throat. Then he moved slowly, stepping forward, coming closer. I gripped the rifle, my pulse pounding in my ears. He stopped at the porch, looking at the door. I didn't wait. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door, and fired. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. The cabin shook from the force of it. Silence followed. Then footsteps running. Fast. Fading into the trees. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with the rifle until the sun came up. When I went outside, there was no blood, no sign that I had hit him. But I knew he had been there. I left that morning. I didn't pack much. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I just got in my truck and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the local news, looking for anything about a trespasser or a break-in near the valley. There was nothing, but I did find something else. An old article, buried deep in the archives, about a series of disappearances in that valley years ago. Hikers, hunters, people who had gone missing without a trace. The only thing they had in common, they had all been last seen near an old cabin deep in the woods. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing. If I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I took the job because I needed to get away from the town, away from the noise, away from everything. I was 20, didn't have much to my name, and this was my first real job. The forestry department hired me to work on maintaining trails, clearing fallen trees, and making sure the deep parts of the woods weren't turning into a fire hazard. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid, and they gave me a cabin to stay in while I worked. That was all I needed. The cabin wasn't much. A single-room structure with a small cot, a stove, a sink with running water from a rain catch system, and a wood-burning heater. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and the closest ranger station was even farther. I had a radio for emergencies, but otherwise, I was on my own. That was fine by me. I liked being alone. The first few weeks were quiet. I spent my days cutting down fallen branches, clearing paths, and making sure the wildlife wasn't getting too close to the trails. The nights were colder than I expected, and the wind howled through the trees like it was alive. But I got used to it, until things started changing. It was small at first, little things. My tools weren't where I left them. The cabin door was cracked open when I knew I had shut it. I kept telling myself it was the wind or my own forgetfulness, but the feeling wouldn't leave. That creeping sensation that I wasn't alone out here. One night, I woke up to a noise outside, a crunching sound, like something stepping on dry leaves. I sat up in bed, my breath frozen in my chest. The wind wasn't blowing. The trees weren't moving, but I could hear it. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it through the window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a stray dog, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my door. Not animal prints, boots. Someone had been walking around my cabin in the night. I tried to radio it in, but the static was thick, and I couldn't get a signal. I told myself it was just a lost hiker, someone who got turned around and wandered too close. But I knew better. No one should have been this far out. That night, I locked the door, made sure my hatchet was within reach, and tried to sleep. The knocking started around midnight. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the wooden door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever was outside didn't say a word, just kept knocking. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. Then it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my fingers wrapped around the handle of my hatchet. In the morning, I checked outside. No footprints this time. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched never left. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. I stopped working late. As soon as the sun started setting, I was in the cabin with the door locked. Then one night, I woke up to the door creaking open. I had locked it. I had made sure. I bolted up, grabbed my flashlight, and aimed it at the door. Nothing, but the door was open. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my bag. I was done. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the money. Something was out here, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it wanted. I started the hike back to the road. It was a long walk, miles of dense forest with no cell service. I moved fast, keeping my hatchet in my hand, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Then I saw them, boot prints in the dirt, fresh, and they weren't mine. I kept walking, faster. My heart was pounding. The trees felt too quiet. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I just kept moving, my legs burning as I pushed forward. The sound followed me, matching my steps. I could feel eyes on me. The road was close. I could see the break in the trees, just a little farther. Then the footsteps stopped. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my bag in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I looked back once, just trees, nothing there. But I knew better. I never went back. I never asked what was out there. I just left, and I never looked back. I never expected to go back to my grandfather's cabin, not after what happened when I was a kid. It was a place that had been in our family for decades, sitting deep in the woods where the land stretched for miles without a single sign of civilization. My grandfather had lived there alone until he passed away, and after that, the place sat untouched, left to the elements and time. I was 28 when I found myself driving up that old dirt road again, my truck bouncing over the uneven surface as I climbed higher into the mountains. It was early November, just before winter would set in for real, but the air was already cold enough to bite through my jacket. The reason I was there was simple. The land had been in my family for years, but after my grandfather died, no one had done anything with it. My dad had always talked about fixing it up, maybe turning it into a hunting cabin or even selling it, but he never did. And now that the place had been sitting there for years, it had started to fall apart. I had decided I would take a few days off work and go up there to check it out, maybe fix what I could before the snow made the road impassable. I wasn't exactly excited about the idea. I had memories of that place, and most of them weren't good. It wasn't that my grandfather was a bad man. He was just different. A quiet, serious type who spent more time out in the woods than he did with people. Even as a kid, I had always felt like something about the cabin made me uneasy. Maybe it was how isolated it was, or the way the trees seemed to press in close around the clearing, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. Or maybe it was the fact that every time I stayed there, I felt like something was watching me. I told myself it was just childhood paranoia. I had been a nervous kid, always afraid of things that weren't real. But as I got closer to the cabin, those old feelings started creeping back. By the time I pulled up in front of the place, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The wood had darkened with age, the porch sagged slightly, and the windows were clouded with dust. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, just looking at it. Something about it felt wrong, but I had driven all the way up there, and I wasn't about to turn around just because of some stupid feeling. So, I grabbed my bag from the truck, made sure my rifle was loaded, and headed inside. The inside of the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The air was stale, the kind of stillness that comes when a place has been abandoned for too long. I checked the pantry, but most of the food had gone bad long ago. I would have to rely on the supplies I brought with me. I spent the first hour checking the place over, making sure there weren't any leaks in the roof or signs of animals getting inside. Everything was intact, which was a small relief. But as the last light faded outside, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I told myself it was just being alone in an old place, but deep down I wasn't so sure. I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, set up my sleeping bag on the couch, and tried to relax. The wind had picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan. Every so often, I would hear something move outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. Then, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard something else, a sound that wasn't the wind. It was faint, but it was there, something moving just outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, making everything feel smaller, more enclosed. Another sound, closer this time. Footsteps, not heavy, but deliberate. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tightly as I got up and moved toward the window. The glass was so dirty I could barely see out, but I caught just a glimpse of movement in the trees. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, waiting to see if they would move again. But after a few seconds, everything went silent. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just an animal. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for tracks. The ground was hard, frozen in some places, but near the edge of the clearing, I found them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. They led from the treeline to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the porch before turning back the way they came. Who the hell was walking around out here barefoot in the middle of November? I followed the tracks a little way into the woods, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. Whoever it was, they had come right up to the cabin, stood there for a while, and then left. That was enough for me. I spent the rest of the day making sure the cabin was secure. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept my rifle within reach at all times. As the sun set, I braced myself for another long night. The wind picked up again, rattling the trees, making the whole forest feel alive. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself that whoever had been out there was probably just some drifter passing through. But then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They came right up onto the porch. I gripped my rifle, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Something shifted outside the door. The handle rattled. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound over the crackling of the fire. But whatever had been out there was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, thin, and completely still, watching me leave. I never went back to my grandfather's cabin after that, and I never found out who or what had been out there in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I think about that place, and I wonder if it's still watching. I didn't want the job. That's the truth. But when you're out of work for 6 months and bills keep stacking up, you take what you can get. It was the fall of 2017 when I found myself accepting a night security job at an old graveyard on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. The ad didn't say much, just that they needed someone to watch over the place at night, keep an eye on a small cabin on the property, and report any trespassers. The pay was decent, better than what most places were offering for someone with my work history, and I figured it would be easy. After all, who in their right mind would want to mess around in a graveyard at night? The first night, I drove up to the place just before sundown. The graveyard wasn't massive, but it had been around for a long time. The headstones ranged from old, crumbling slabs to newer, polished ones, and the whole place had a damp, heavy feel to it. The cabin was just past the graves, near the woods. It was small, built from old, dark wood, with a covered porch and a single window facing the cemetery. My job was simple. Stay in the cabin, check the graveyard every couple of hours, make sure no one was messing around, and lock up at sunrise. The man who hired me, an older guy named Tom, gave me the key to the cabin and a flashlight, then left without much else to say. Inside, the cabin was bare. Just a wooden chair, a small cot, and a desk with a few old ledgers on it. There was no electricity, just a gas lantern, and the place smelled like damp wood and dust. I tried not to think about how many people had probably worked this job before me. The first few hours were fine. I sat on the porch, watching as the last light faded from the sky. The graveyard was quiet, the only sound coming from the trees swaying in the wind. Around 10, I did my first walkthrough, scanning the area with my flashlight. The headstones cast long, jagged shadows, and the air felt colder than it should have for an autumn night. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat on the cot, trying to get comfortable. That's when I heard it. A single, sharp sound like wood creaking under pressure. I held my breath, listening. The cabin was old, It could have been settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch outside. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my heart pounding. The steps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, then took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty, the graveyard still and silent. I swept the light around, checking the trees, the path leading back to the road. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. I told myself it was my imagination, went back inside, and locked the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, that they had stopped walking the moment I opened the door. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. By the time dawn broke, I was ready to leave. Tom showed up right on time, giving me a nod as I handed him the keys. "Any trouble?" he asked. I thought about telling him what I heard but decided against it. Maybe it had just been my nerves. "Nah," I said. "Quiet night." I drove home, trying to convince myself I was just jumpy, that I'd get used to the job. The second night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. When I heard the footsteps, I didn't wait. I jumped up, yanked the door open, and shined my light into the darkness. Still nothing, but the porch felt different, like someone had just been standing there. The wood still seemed to sway slightly under the weight of something that wasn't there anymore. I stepped outside, my breath clouding in the cold air. The trees were still. The cemetery was just as I had left it. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I saw it. One of the old graves, near the edge of the tree line, had been disturbed. The dirt looked like it had been moved recently, not dug up, but shifted. I walked toward it slowly, scanning the area with my flashlight. The name on the headstone was worn away by time, the edges cracked and chipped. I crouched down and touched the soil. It was soft, loose, like someone had been digging with their hands. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up, shined my light around again. Still nothing. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat there with my flashlight on until sunrise. This time, when Tom showed up, I told him, "There's something weird going on out here," I said. "I heard footsteps last night, twice, and one of the graves looks like it's been messed with." Tom just stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah," he said, "that happens sometimes." That was all he said. He didn't explain. He didn't act surprised. Just took the key and walked away. I should have quit right then. Should have gotten in my car and never come back. But I didn't. The third night was worse. I barely stepped outside, but I still heard the footsteps. Slow, steady, stopping just before I reached the door. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something new, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. The sound was coming from the graveyard. I didn't want to go out there, but I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped onto the porch. The dragging sound stopped instantly. I scanned the graves. The disturbed one was worse now. More of the dirt had been moved, and something lay at the foot of the headstone. A single muddy boot, not old, not decayed, new. Someone had been out there. Someone was still out there. I backed away, locking myself in the cabin. I didn't sleep, just sat there, gripping the flashlight, listening. By the time morning came, I'd made my decision. When Tom showed up, I didn't even wait for him to ask. "I'm done," I said, handing him the key. "Find someone else." He nodded like he expected it, like it wasn't the first time. I left without looking back. A few days later, I checked the local news. There was nothing about a body being found, nothing about disturbed graves. But a week later, the cemetery put up new signs. No trespassing after dark. I never found out who or what was out there, but I never went back to that place again. and I never will. It was the first time I had driven down that road in years. The asphalt was cracked, the white lines barely visible in the wash of my headlights. The rain had started not long after I left town. A slow drizzle at first, but it had picked up now, drumming against the roof of my truck, making the world outside seem even darker. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror every so often, though I wasn't sure why. I hadn't meant to take this road. I never did. But something in me, maybe habit, maybe something else, had led me here again. It was the road that passed by my ex-wife's cabin. I had no reason to be near it anymore. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since the divorce. I had moved on. Or at least, that's what I told myself. She had stayed behind, keeping the cabin in the woods where we used to spend weekends, where we had once planned a future. It had been a long time since I'd thought about any of it. But now, as I drove this road, the memories were pushing their way back into my mind, unwanted and heavy. The rain blurred the windshield, and I turned up the wipers. The road curved ahead, dipping slightly before rising into a stretch of forest so thick it swallowed the light from my headlights. My fingers tightened on the wheel. I knew that just beyond those trees, tucked away on a piece of land most people never knew existed, was the cabin. I told myself I wouldn't look, but I did. The cabin was there, just like it had always been. The dark shape of it sat against the trees, its windows black and empty. No lights, no movement. It looked abandoned, and maybe it was, but something was wrong. I couldn't say what it was at first, just a feeling, something in my chest that tightened as I slowed the truck. My headlights barely reached the edge of the driveway, but I could see just enough to know something wasn't right. The grass had grown too tall, wild and unkempt, but there were tracks in the dirt, recent ones. Someone had been here. The last I had heard, she had left the cabin behind, moved on to a different town, a different life. She had never wanted to come back here. So who had been here? I should have kept driving. I knew that, but instead I pulled over. The rain was steady as I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, the same smell I remembered from years ago. The memories clawed at me, but I pushed them down. The driveway was rutted with mud, and the tracks led all the way up to the front porch. I moved slowly, my pulse in my throat. The front door was closed, but I could see something in the faint light from my truck's headlights. Scratches along the wood, deep ones. Animal, maybe, a bear. That's what I told myself. But I didn't believe it. I took a step closer. My breath came slow and steady, but my stomach was tight. The scratches weren't random. They were too deliberate, too controlled. They ran in straight lines, parallel, as if someone had dragged something sharp against the door over and over. The windows were still dark, but as I moved toward the side of the cabin, I noticed something else. One of the windows was open, just a crack. I didn't want to be here anymore. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A sound from inside. Something moving. I froze, my back stiff, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The rain was loud, but not loud enough to drown out the noise coming from inside. A shuffle, a creak of wood. Someone was in there. I took a step back, my boots slipping slightly in the mud. The open window, the tracks, the scratches on the door. This wasn't just some animal. I turned, ready to get back to my truck, to get the hell out of there, when the front door creaked open behind me. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I already knew I wasn't alone. I moved fast, faster than I thought I could, my boots digging into the mud as I ran for my truck. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through my jacket, making everything slick. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard, my fingers shaking as they gripped the wheel. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I turned the key in the ignition. The truck sputtered but didn't start. I swore under my breath, trying again. Nothing. The rain pounded against the windshield. My breath fogged the glass. My hands were slick with sweat. I glanced up, and that's when I saw it. A shape standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath coming fast, my body frozen in place. But then, finally, the truck roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the gear into drive, my tires spinning against the mud as I tore away from the cabin, from the trees, from whatever had been standing there watching me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove. The rain followed me for miles, drumming against the roof of the truck, masking the sound of my own breathing, my own pounding heartbeat. I didn't take that road again, and I never went back. I had taken the job because I needed the money. It wasn't complicated work, just watching over an old hunting cabin in the hills for a few weeks while the owner was out of the country. He was some rich guy who only came up once or twice a year, and from what I understood, he was worried about squatters or vandals messing with the place. The cabin was isolated, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, and the only way up was a narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees. The job was simple. Stay at the cabin, keep an eye on things, and make sure no one broke in. I had a small generator for power, a propane stove, and a few supplies stocked in the pantry. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but I wasn't expecting luxury. I got there in late October, just as the leaves were turning. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time chopping wood, reading, or walking around the property. There was a small clearing behind the cabin with a fire pit, and beyond that, nothing but trees for miles. The only sounds were the wind through the branches and the occasional bird. It was peaceful in a way. But after the first week, I started noticing things. First, it was small. A few tools I had left outside weren't where I remembered putting them. The axe I had leaned against the chopping block was on the ground the next morning. A bundle of firewood I had stacked was scattered like something had knocked it over. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe some animal, but something about it felt wrong. Then there were the noises. At night, after I turned off the generator and everything was quiet, I'd hear movement outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a coyote, but the way the steps moved, pausing then starting again, felt too deliberate, too human. I started keeping the shotgun close just in case. One morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the front door. They were barefoot, the toes digging into the mud like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. Just standing, watching. I checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone, no tracks leading away, just the prints in front of the door. That night, I locked up early. I made sure the generator had enough fuel, bolted the door, and kept the shotgun loaded next to my bed. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside, listening. The next few days, things escalated. One evening, as I was chopping wood, I noticed something in the trees. A figure, standing between the trunks, half hidden in the shadows. Too far to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I stared for a long time, waiting for him to step forward or turn away, but he didn't. Finally, I picked up the shotgun and raised it slightly, not aiming, just making sure he saw it. When I looked back, he was gone. That night, I didn't turn off the generator. I wanted the lights. I sat in the chair by the window with the shotgun on my lap, listening. The wind was stronger than usual, rustling the trees, making the old wood of the cabin creak. But underneath that, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. The steps moved around the cabin, slow and careful, testing. The sound of fingers brushing against the wood. Then a soft creak on the porch. I stood up slowly, the shotgun heavy in my hands. The porch was just outside the window, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see who was there. I took a breath, then snapped the light switch off. The cabin went dark. For a moment, everything was still. Then the doorknob rattled. I raised the shotgun. The metal was cold against my hands. The knob twisted once, then again, harder this time. Then nothing, just silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found something new. Near the fire pit in the clearing behind the cabin, there was a small pile of bones. Rabbit bones, mostly, clean picked bare, arranged in a careful circle. Someone had been there. Clothes. I thought about leaving. I could pack up, drive back to town, tell the owner I quit. But something about that felt wrong, like I was letting whoever this was win. So I stayed. I checked the shotgun again, made sure the generator had enough fuel to run all night, and I waited. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved along the walls, slow and patient, like whoever was out there was running their fingers along the wood, feeling for weaknesses. Then came the tapping, a slow, rhythmic sound, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. The shotgun was in my lap, my hands gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The tapping stopped. Then, a soft creak, the sound of someone stepping onto the porch. I took a breath and stood up. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I stepped toward the window, just enough to see. There, standing on the porch, was a man. His clothes were dirty, torn in places like he'd been living out in the woods for months. His feet were bare, caked in mud. He was thin, almost skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones. But his eyes were the worst part, wide and empty, locked onto mine through the glass. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he grinned. I don't remember aiming. I don't remember pulling the trigger. But the shotgun roared, shattering the glass, and when I looked again, he was gone. I heard him running, crashing through the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the money. I just drove, not stopping until I was back in town. I told the owner everything. He listened, nodding slowly, like he had heard it all before. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. A few years back, a man had lived in those woods, some kind of hermit surviving off whatever he could find. One winter, he broke into the cabin looking for food. The owner came up early that year and found him there. Instead of calling the cops, he ran him off. The man disappeared into the woods, but people in town swore they still saw him sometimes, lurking near the edge of the trees, waiting. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I never planned on living in my grandfather's old farm cabin. It wasn't supposed to be my place to stay, but life had a way of pushing people toward unexpected roads. When he passed away, my father wanted nothing to do with the place. He had moved to the city decades ago, far from the farm life he grew up in, and he wasn't about to return to it now. My uncles were the same. That left me the only one who didn't mind a little distance from the world. The farm was old, sitting far from town, past a stretch of dirt roads that hardly saw traffic. A long, empty field surrounded the cabin, leading up to the tree line that bordered the back of the property. My grandfather's larger house sat on the other side of the land, but that had been left to decay over the years. The cabin was what remained in livable condition. It was a sturdy, one-room building with a small kitchen space, a cot, and a wood stove. It smelled of old pine and dust when I moved in. I thought it would be peaceful, a quiet retreat from the rush of everyday life. It was for a while. I spent the first few weeks fixing up the place, cutting wood, repairing the fence, and clearing out the shed. There was something calming about the isolation. No traffic, no distant sounds of people. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. But things changed after the first month. It started with small things. At first, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the tree line. They weren't mine. I never walked that far into the field unless I had a reason. These prints were scattered, leading in and out of the trees, too large for an animal but not quite right for a person either. They were uneven, some deeper than others, as if whoever made them had an odd way of walking. I ignored it at first. People passed through rural land all the time, hunters or lost hikers. But as the days went on, I noticed more. A pile of sticks arranged in a strange pattern near the cabin. A rusted knife stuck into the wood of my fence. My tools moved from where I had left them, always just slightly out of place. One night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up in the cot, heart pounding, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again on the other side of the cabin, just out of view from the small window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hunting rifle was by the door, but I didn't reach for it. Instead, I waited, gripping the blanket in my hands, until the sound slowly faded. By morning, there were new footprints in the dirt. I started locking the door every night, even though I doubted a simple lock would stop anyone determined enough to get in. I made sure my rifle was always within reach. The feeling of being watched settled in, something I couldn't shake even during the day. I worked outside as normal, but I was always looking toward the trees, scanning for movement. It wasn't just the trees that felt off. The field itself, wide and open, suddenly seemed too exposed. I had the overwhelming sense that someone or something was out there watching. One evening, as the sun was setting, I spotted movement near the old farmhouse. A shape too far to make out clearly, standing near the broken fence. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, waiting for it to move, but it didn't. Then, just as the last light disappeared, it turned and walked into the woods. I didn't sleep much that night. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It wasn't at the door or the walls, but underneath the cabin. The space beneath the cabin was barely big enough for an animal to crawl under, but something was down there. The scratching was slow, methodical, like someone dragging something sharp along the wooden floorboards from below. I forced myself to stay in the cot, listening. After an hour, it stopped. In the morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. There was no sign of anything having crawled under, no holes or disturbances in the dirt, but the sound had been real. The footprints in the field were closer now. That night, I locked the door as usual and placed my rifle beside me. I stayed awake, waiting. The scratching came again. This time, it lasted longer. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to silence. No scratching, no movement, but the air in the cabin felt heavier, like something had changed. Then I saw it. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I left the next morning. I packed up whatever I could carry, loaded my truck, and didn't look back. I didn't care about the land, the cabin, or what it meant to my family. Whatever was out there, Whoever was watching me wasn't gonna stop. When I told my father I was done with the place, he didn't argue. He didn't even ask why. A few months later, I heard from one of my uncles. He mentioned that the old farmhouse had finally collapsed, years of decay finally catching up with it. But the cabin was still standing. I asked if anyone had been out there since I left. He said no. The land was still in the family, but no one wanted to claim it. That was fine by me. I never went back, and I never wanted to know what would have happened if I had stayed. I was a cop for 18 years. I spent most of that time in rural areas, places where backup was a long way out, where you had to rely on yourself more than anything else. The kind of places where folks handled their own problems and only called us when things got too bad. It was early November when it happened. The year doesn't really matter, but I was 41. The department had me assigned to a stretch of forestland that covered miles and miles, a place where people went to hunt, fish, and sometimes disappear. It wasn't unusual for folks to go missing out there. Some got lost, some didn't want to be found, and some had worse luck. There was an old hunting cabin out in that part of the woods. It had belonged to a man named Thomas Geller, a retired game warden who lived out there alone. He'd been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. His sister had called it in, said she hadn't heard from him, and that was unusual. We figured maybe he'd fallen, gotten hurt. Maybe an animal had gotten to him. Either way, it was my job to go check it out. The drive out was long, nearly 2 hours from town. The roads turned to dirt, then to barely more than trails. My truck was the only thing that could handle it. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky, the trees casting long shadows. The place looked normal at first. The cabin was small, made of old, dark wood. The door was shut. The truck he used was still there, parked beside the cabin, covered in leaves. But when I got out of my truck, something felt off. The air was too still. No birds, no wind, nothing. I walked up to the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. The door was unlocked, so I pushed it open. The smell hit me first. If you've ever smelled a dead body, you don't forget it. It's thick, sweet, and rotten all at once. It clings to the air. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and stepped inside. The living area was small, just a cot, a wood stove, and a table. Everything looked normal except for the smell. Then I saw the blood. It was dried, dark brown, smeared across the wooden floor leading into the next room. A trail. My gut tightened. I stepped carefully, following it. The bedroom was worse. Thomas was there, or what was left of him. He was lying beside the bed, his head turned at a wrong angle. His chest was torn open, deep wounds across his ribs. The blood had pooled and dried beneath him, thick and black. I scanned the room. The window was open, curtain blowing slightly. The bed was messy, covers thrown aside. There was no weapon, no sign of struggle beyond the blood. I backed out slowly, my heart pounding. I radioed it in, but I already knew what they'd say. It would take hours for anyone to get out here. The sun was setting. I'd have to wait. I stepped back outside and leaned against my truck, breathing slow, trying to clear my head. That's when I saw the boot print. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the leaves, was a fresh boot print. Not Thomas's. Someone else had been here, maybe still was. I drew my sidearm and scanned the treeline. Nothing moved. The air was still thick, heavy. I had a choice to make. Sit in my truck and wait for backup or start looking. Every part of me said to wait, but I knew if someone was out here, they were long gone before backup arrived. I started following the boot prints. They led away from the cabin, into the trees. The ground was soft, and the prints were deep. Whoever it was, they were moving fast. I followed them for maybe half a mile, the woods growing darker around me. Then they just stopped. The last print was there in the dirt, clear as day. But after that, nothing. No more tracks, no broken branches, nothing. It was like they'd just vanished. I stood there listening. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then, just behind me, I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves. I spun, gun up, but there was nothing there. I wasn't alone. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. Whoever it was, they were watching me. I turned and moved fast, back toward the cabin. My breath was loud in my ears. The trees felt too close. The shadows stretched too long. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was gone. The cabin stood dark against the trees, and my truck felt too far away. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and gripped the wheel. The radio crackled. Backup was still 2 hours out. I stared at the cabin. The door was still shut. The window was still open. Then I saw the shape. The figure standing just inside the tree-line. Tall, still, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. Then slowly they stepped back, vanished into the trees. I stayed in that truck, gun in my lap, until backup arrived. They found nothing. No prints, no signs. Just Thomas's body and the tracks I'd found. We never figured out who did it. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. But I know they were there, watching, and I know they still are. I didn't plan on staying in the cabin for long. It wasn't even mine. It belonged to a friend of mine, Greg, who had asked me to check in on it while he was away. He had gotten it cheap, a small wooden place tucked away deep in the woods of Northumberland. Said he planned on fixing it up for weekend trips but hadn't had the time yet. I figured it would be simple. Drive up, make sure everything was in order, spend a night just to get a break from the city, and then leave. I liked the idea of a quiet night alone. No work, no noise, just me, a fire, and a few beers. Sounded peaceful. But the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The cabin looked normal at first, just old, nothing more. A single-story wooden structure with a small porch and a slanted roof, tucked between the trees like it had always been there. The drive up had been rough, the dirt path uneven and covered in leaves, and by the time I reached it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The air was crisp, damp with the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Smelled like wood and dust. The furniture was basic, just a couch, a table, a few chairs. A small fireplace sat along the far wall with a pile of chopped logs beside it. Everything was just as Greg had described. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe it was the stillness of the woods, the unfamiliar silence that made every creak in the floorboards sound too loud. I shrugged it off, brought in my bag, and set up for the night. I lit a fire, cracked open a beer, and settled into one of the chairs near the fireplace. The warmth was welcome after the cold outside, and after a while, I started to relax. Then I saw her. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Through the window, past the trees, a figure stood near the edge of the clearing. A woman. She was too far away to see clearly, just a dark shape against the tree line, unmoving.
Ist her.
She didn't move. The fire crackled beside me, the warmth pressing against my skin, but I felt cold. She was standing there, watching. I told myself it was nothing. Probably a hiker who had wandered too far. Maybe she had gotten lost. But something about the way she stood, so still, so quiet, made my skin crawl. I turned away for a second, just to grab my jacket, and when I looked back, she was gone. I exhaled, shaking my head, just my mind playing tricks. Still, I locked the door. The night dragged on. The wind picked up, rattling against the windows. I told myself it was just another normal night in the woods. But then, sometime past midnight, I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps on the wooden porch. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin in a flickering dim light. The only sound was the soft crackle of the remaining embers. Then a single, long creak. The sound of weight shifting on the wooden boards outside. Someone was out there. I moved as quietly as I could, reaching for my flashlight. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I stepped toward the window, slowly, careful not to make a sound. And then, just beyond the glass, I saw her again. She was closer now, standing just at the edge of the porch. My breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, too pale, her features sharp in the dim light. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her frame, her hair matted against her face. She was staring right at me. My grip on the flashlight tightened. She didn't move. I didn't move. Seconds passed, long and stretched. Then she stepped forward. I stumbled back. My heart pounded against my ribs. A hand pressed against the window. Her fingers were long, too long, the nails dirt-stained and jagged. I turned away, grabbing my bag, my keys, ready to leave. I didn't care about anything else. I just needed to get out. But when I looked back, she was gone. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat near the fireplace, my back against the wall, my flashlight clutched in my hands. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind howled, the branches scratched against the walls, but nothing else happened. By the time the sun rose, I was already packed. I didn't bother checking outside. I just got in my car and left. I told Greg about it later, trying to laugh it off. He just frowned, said I must have been tired, imagining things. Maybe he was right, but I knew what I saw. And when I checked the news a few days later, I found something that made my stomach turn. A woman had gone missing in those woods months ago, never found. They had called off the search weeks before I arrived. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I never planned on buying a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It just happened. It was 2016, and I was working in St. Louis, living in a small apartment that felt more like a storage unit than a home. The walls were thin. My upstairs neighbor stomped like an elephant, and sirens never stopped wailing outside my window. I had been saving up for years, thinking maybe I'd get a small house in the suburbs one day, but the city was wearing me down. Then, one night, I found a listing online. A small old cabin deep in the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri. It was cheap, almost too cheap, but the pictures looked decent. A simple wooden structure, a porch, a stone fireplace, and a few acres of land. The description was vague, but I figured it was just one of those forgotten properties, something someone had inherited and didn't want. 2 weeks later, it was mine. The drive out there was peaceful. The roads twisted through thick forests, and the farther I went, the fewer cars I saw. By the time I reached the gravel path leading to the cabin, it was clear I was truly alone out here. There were no other houses in sight, no traffic noise, just trees and silence. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled different, cleaner. I walked up to the porch, keys in hand, and pushed the door open. The place was smaller than I expected. Just a single open room with a tiny kitchen in the corner and a wood-burning stove against the far wall. There was an old couch, a wooden table, and a single bed near the window. A thick layer of dust covered everything. The windows had been shut for years, and the air inside was stale. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, sweeping out dust, wiping down the counters, checking the old cabinets. There wasn't much in them. A few rusted cans of food, some mouse droppings, a chipped coffee mug. The previous owner had left behind a few things. A pile of firewood stacked against the wall, a hunting knife on the table, and an old axe leaning near the door. It wasn't much, but I liked it. That first night, I sat on the porch, drinking a beer and listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets chirped. A light breeze rustled the leaves. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I went inside, locked the door, and climbed into bed. The mattress was old and lumpy, but I was too tired to care. The wind picked up outside, and tree branches scratched against the cabin walls. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it sounded too heavy. I sat up and reached for the flashlight I had left on the table. Clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the wooden floor, the old stove, the closed front door. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. I sat there listening, waiting. Nothing. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Maybe the woods were playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down. The mattress creaked under my weight. I closed my eyes and tried to slow my breathing. Then I heard it again. Closer. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was out there. I sat up, listening. The footsteps were right outside the cabin now, moving along the porch. Slow, steady. My truck was parked just outside, but the keys were across the room on the table. Even if I got to them, I'd have to unlock the door, start the engine, and hope whoever or whatever was out there didn't get to me first. I grabbed the hunting knife from the table and crept to the window. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. The porch was empty, but something wasn't right. The axe. I had left it leaning against the wall near the door. Now it was on the ground. Someone had moved it. A chill ran through me. I backed away from the window, gripping the knife. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an hour, listening, waiting. The footsteps didn't come back. At some point, exhaustion took over. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the knife, and waited for the sun to come up. By morning, everything seemed normal. The forest was quiet. The sky was clear. The axe was still on the ground. I told myself it had just been an animal. Maybe a bear had wandered up to the porch, sniffed around, and knocked the axe over. Maybe I was overreacting, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I spent the next few days fixing up the place, chopping wood, clearing out old junk, patching a hole in the roof. I tried to put the first night out of my mind, but then things started happening. I'd wake up and find things moved. My boots, which I always left by the door, would be on the other side of the room. The coffee mug I left on the table would be in the sink. One morning, I stepped outside and found footprints in the dirt. Not mine, barefoot. They led from the woods to my porch, stopped at the door, then turned back. That was it. I packed my things and left that afternoon. I never went back. I never sold the place. I just let it sit there, forgotten. A few months later, curiosity got the best of me. I did some research on the cabin, digging through old records, trying to find out more about the previous owner. It had been abandoned for over 20 years. The last person who lived there was a man named Richard Porter. He had gone missing in 1995, never found. His truck was still in the woods, rusting away. The police had searched the area but never found a body. The case went cold. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know who or what was outside my cabin that night. But I do know one thing. I won't ever go back.